never mind. Welcome to the meeting of the State House Progressive Caucus. Today we are going to be hearing from staff from the Fair Share Coalition, from Public Assets Institute, Anka Howell, who will be running through the tax proposals that will be hopefully passed out of House Ways and Means not too long from now. And but first we'll go ahead and start with a round of introductions. I'm Rep. Kate Logan from Chittenden 16 in the Old North End in downtown Burlington.
My name is Annika Heilwell. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for Public Assets Institute, where I manage the Fair Share for Vermont campaign and the Fair Share for Vermont coalition.
Heather Thomas, Executive Director of the Progressive Party. Representative Chloe Tomlinson from Chittenden 21, which is Newski, and I sit on the House Constitution Committee. And I'm Courtney Record, House Clerk's Office.
And on Zoom,
Representative Brian Sheena from Burlington, Chittenden 15.
Thanks, Brian. Annika, take it away.
It always takes me a little bit to share screen, so I'm so sorry that you're about to see maybe a slightly embarrassing process.
No problem.
But one moment. Okay. So, yeah, thank you all for inviting me and taking the time, and for the Progressive Caucus's historic focus on fair taxation. I am very happy to be here. So I'm going to run through basically a variety of kind of economic indicators before jumping into our current policy, basically setting up our current state of economic inequality that I'm sure a lot of you are already very aware of, but kind of putting it into graphs, showing how we got here, what's happening right now, and then I'm going to jump into the policy. There's a bit of messaging kind of scattered throughout the presentation, and I'm always happy to chat more with anybody about messaging. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the end. There's a lot of resurgence at the moment about wealth tax flight and more myths that I've been hearing the last couple of years about wealthy people fleeing states once they make changes to taxes on high income. So I just want to bring up some data and kind of go through what we actually see on the ground. I am not sure how long this is going to take me. I think there will certainly be time at the end for questions, but please cover me throughout as well. Okay, so I'm going to start off by basically setting up the scene of where we are as far as inequality goes and as far as basically tax capacity of folks at the top. So this graph is basically showing 100 years of, as you see, gains and losses of income inequality. And when we're talking about income inequality, what we're referring to is the share of overall income that's being controlled by the top 1%. And as you can see, income inequality was actually decreasing. This is a graph that is specific to Vermont. Sorry. No, so this is a graph that is specific to Vermont. Income inequality was decreasing throughout a lot of the 1900s. And then you can see that that really radically and drastically turned around in the early 1980s. And as a lot of us know, that is corresponding to changes in federal tax policy that basically made it so that taxes were slashed for wealthy folks and for high income earners. And it correlates to income inequality skyrocketing. I also want to emphasize that in this period, a lot of these tax changes that were happening were at the federal level. So that means that tax rates were being slashed for high earners federally. But until the early 2000s, Vermont actually just directly piggybacked off of federal personal income taxes. We basically charged our taxes as a portion of your federal tax liability. And what that means in practice is that when taxes, when taxes were slashed for high earners at the federal level, that went on to our tax code. So taxes were also slashed in Vermont personal income taxes for high earners. And kind of to put this into context, what we see is that if we look at the actual effective tax rate, it's hard to look at what tax rates were in a historical way because we used to piggyback off of federal taxes and now we no longer do. So our current top marginal rate is 8.75%, but we didn't have a top marginal rate throughout the 1900s because it was a portion of federal tax liability. But you can do, we basically looked at what the actual numbers would have been if we take that as a portion of federal tax liability. And what you can see is that for a lot like the 60s and 70s, the highest top marginal rate effectively in Vermont was in the high teens. And right now it's about 8.75%. So here in Vermont, our personal income taxes also plummeted for high earners. Kind of just to put this in a different way, incomes of the top 1% are rising much faster than incomes of the bottom 99%. So basically for folks in the top 1%, incomes are going up very quickly. For everyone else, they're staying a little more stagnant. So this red line is showing incomes of the bottom 99%, so everyone except for the top 1% is, slowly rising, but staying pretty level, compared to incomes of the top 1% that have more volatility, but are overall kind of going up at a much faster rate. And what this means in practice, so this graph I wanted to put in here because I wanted a visualization, but it's important that this is outdated and the difference is now much greater. So this says 16. In actuality, the incomes of the top 1% are on average 20 times higher than incomes of the bottom 99%. So that's how this is really rippling out and affecting all of our lives.
And this is nationally, or no,
This is
in
specific
Vermont.
to Vermont.
Oh.
Yeah, everything that I'm gonna share today, I'll make a note if something is national, but everything is specific to Vermont.
I see it says Vermont at the top now.
Oh, no, it is, I should have made a note that like when we're looking at income inequality, like the graph that I was showing at the beginning, we see that reflected in federal trends as well. But I think that there's sometimes this idea that Vermont doesn't have as much income inequality as other states. There's this idea that like that's more of a national problem,
Yes.
it's not a state problem. And what we see is that Vermont is very much a reflection of national trends. And then kind of just to put this a little bit further into context, what this means in practice is that for most people, most Vermonters are struggling to meet their basic needs, while the top 1% has more than enough left over. So this is basically a graph showing the basic needs budget put onto different income groups and just showing the top 1% and how much they have left over after meeting their basic needs. Okay, gonna zoom out to how our tax system is interacting with current trends of inequality. So currently in Vermont, the top 1% of Vermont income earners are paying a smaller portion of their income in state and local taxes than many middle income earners. And I think that this is also something that I find that folks are very frequently surprised about because, we have a reputation of having a very progressive tax system. And luckily, we do have a very progressive tax system for basically the bottom 80% of Vermont income earners, which is great. And a lot of that is due to really positive steps that the legislature has taken, particularly things like earned income tax credits, child tax credits, as well as having a progressive income tax structure, which is really important and not present in all states. So I'm just gonna take 1 second to go into why we have this system where it's basically progressive through the bottom 80% and then gets regressive at the top. So here's our 3 types of tax systems. As probably a lot of us know, sales taxes are purely regressive. We are all basically paying the same dollar amount on a good in sales taxes, so therefore it hits different income groups really differently. Property taxes are this upside down U, where they're progressive through the bottom half and then regressive through the top half, basically. And personal income taxes are purely progressive, which is fantastic. And that is basically our personal income taxes are working to offset those other tax systems that have this really clear regressivity at the top. Now to kind of interplay this with our federal tax situation. So there's been a series of tax cuts for high earners at the federal level that have caused, ripple-on effects into Vermont. And I'm just gonna highlight the 2 most recent waves of federal tax cuts. This is not the most recent wave, this is the second to most recent wave. But I just wanna highlight that I'm gonna go into basically 2 rounds of tax cuts, but there have been many rounds of tax cuts at the federal level for high earners, particularly beginning in the early 1980s. Tax rates for high earners have been absolutely slashed at the federal level from being in the 90s in the mid 1900s to now having a high top marginal rate of 37%. So in 2017, the first Trump administration passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which predominantly slashed taxes for folks at the top. So in this graph, basically you can see that we've separated the bottom 80% of taxpayers into 4 different chunks, and then further disaggregated the top 20% into the top 1%, next 4%, and next 15%. So that entire chunk meant that the top 20% of Vermont taxpayers saved about $350 million in federal taxes just in 2018. I will note that following that tax law, the Vermont legislature chose to fully decouple from personal income taxes at the federal level. This was really good, and the reason that it's really positive is that it's made it so that federal tax changes that are basically slashing taxes for high earners at the federal level at least aren't slashing their Vermont personal income taxes. So like due to that tax law and due to the tax law that we're about to talk about that was passed last summer, we aren't expecting a decrease in Vermont in personal income taxes, which is really crucial and cannot be said about all states. So it's really important work that the Vermont legislature did. So now moving on to our current situation. So last summer, the Trump administration passed what I am going to be referring to as HR 1, which was basically a historic transfer of wealth from everybody to the top 1%. Well, really to the top 20%, but ultimately a wealth transfer up. So due to the passage of HR 1, the top 1% of Vermonters are set to receive an average federal tax cut of $57,000 per filer just this year. So I want to emphasize that's $57,000 per filer per year. In aggregate, what that means is that the top 1% are set to save a little over $200 million in federal taxes just this year.
Can you remind us where 1% starts annual income-wise?
Thank you so much. Yes. Currently, the top 1% starts at about $586,000 in income. So that's folks making a lot of money already who are set to save a huge amount of money.
In Vermont.
Just in Vermont, yeah. I'll throw out there that this analysis was done by our national partners called the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, who are a very trusted tax think tank. JFO did a kind of brief analysis of this same thing, basically looking into the level of tax cuts that Pat brought to the Senate Finance Committee earlier this year. He wanted to emphasize that this was a very preliminary analysis, so I am emphasizing that, but the numbers were pretty similar. So this is pretty verified analysis at this point. To zoom out a little bit, the top 20% are set to save a little under $740 million in federal taxes just this year due to the passage of this law. And as I'm sure the legislators in this room know, our state budget is currently $9.4 billion, a bit over $9 billion. So this is really real money that Vermonters are saving in federal taxes. This is a significant chunk.
Can you remind us like the income for top 20%? Like where's that from?
I am slightly forgetting. I believe that the top 5% comes in somewhere in the 300 range, and the top 20% comes in somewhere in the 200 range. But I will double check that and I'll get back. Oh, here it's putting the top 20% at starting at $150,000. I will say that income ranges for where ITEP puts income ranges are very frequently quite different than where JFO puts income ranges. So I will check in with Pat, the JFO office, and show that I know where they're putting their limits. So in order to pay for these really massive tax cuts that are being given to the wealthiest Americans, including the wealthiest Vermonters, the federal government really slashed funding for some key programs, including Medicaid, including food assistance, including housing support. And on top of kind of those slashes that came last summer, we're seeing just a far more unstable federal funding landscape. We're seeing slashed funding to nonprofit grants. We're seeing politicized decisions around things like disaster recovery aid. We're seeing a federal government, particularly a president that is continuing to talk about the fact that the federal government can't be like picking up the costs of these social programs that it has been for a really long time. And before this moment, we already had a lot of unmet need. So I just wanted to pull up this graph because this is showing basically where our revenue comes from in the state of Vermont and where it goes. And we're not going to go through any of these nitty-gritties. We call this the spaghetti graph at public assets. And I have looked at it for so long, so many times, and I love looking at it, but we're just going to look at it kind of in aggregate right now. Where this is the graph that highlights the federal dollars. So all of the blue coming from revenue sources to spending category is all federal. So that makes up about a third of our state budget at the moment. So when we're thinking about basically what is more precarious at the moment, what's on the line, what is kind of at risk when we have this more unreliable partner in the federal government, that's the chunk we're looking at, and that's really significant. And then this basically shows the effects of basically recent, very specific federal policy choices of the tax cuts to the top 5% compared to basically the amount of federal funding cuts that we are expecting. And once again, this is specific to Vermont. And I want to emphasize that this is by no means exhaustive. This is basically showing a few categories that we know how their funding cuts are going to trickle onto Vermont, but this isn't including things like disaster recovery, nonprofit grants. This also isn't including limits that the federal government put into provider taxes in HR 1, which is going to cause some pretty significant revenue downturns down the line.
So this is just the immediate impacts of HR 1, like this year. Yeah. And sorry, one more question. So for Medicaid, is that reduction primarily due to changing eligibility requirements?
I believe so. Okay. But I need to double check on that. I did not read this graph, my coworker Julie did. So I'll ask her specifically on that because in this moment I'm getting a little nervous that I'm incorrect. So I'll check back with you, but I think yes.
Yeah, I think that's probably, well, we know where the tax credits are coming from, but I would love a little bit more information about the 3 squares and Medicaid data in particular.
And my understanding of 3 squares is that that is eligibility, a little bit of cost sharing, and then I will double check on that.
Okay, thank you.
So this is our overarching message, and I can share this PowerPoint with you guys after saying this is a lot of words. But basically what we are saying is that in a moment when Congress and the President are giving really massive tax cuts to the wealthiest Vermonters, while many Vermonters are struggling to meet their basic needs, it really just makes sense to increase taxes, recapture at least a portion of those federal tax cuts for the wealthiest in order to make needed investments. Okay, we're now gonna go into 2 policies that have gotten a lot of airtime in the news and in this building and in all of our direct lives in the last couple of weeks. So first we're gonna talk about the Cole-Priestley amendment to the miscellaneous tax bill, which I will say pulls directly from H621, which is a bill that was introduced to House Ways and Means by Representative Wassenbach earlier this year. So this amendment would have created 2 new tax brackets on income over $500,000 a year and income over $1 million a year. It would increase taxes on income over $500,000 by 3% and income over $1 million by an additional 2%. I want to stress that these are marginal taxes. You don't basically threshold in and immediately see a massive tax increase. It's only the dollars above that threshold that would be impacted by this tax. It would raise between $100 million and $200 million in annual state revenue. The reason that I am putting a really large range is that the most recent JFO estimate was, I believe, $113 million based off of 2025 incomes. We are expecting an updated number once it starts going through the committee process. Our internal revenue estimate was $168 million. I will say that whenever we get the 2026 revenue estimate from JFO, we will be also using that number. So because the threshold for the top 1% is at $586,000, it'll impact a little over 1% of Vermonters. And I also want to emphasize that this would raise the top 1%'s taxes less than the tax cut they are expected to get this year to the federal government. So even if this policy were passed, when we put the 2 policies together of basically the tax cut that they're going to get from the federal government and the tax increase that they would see from this law, they would still get an average overall tax cut of over $11,000 per filer. So this is still giving them a tax cut at the end of the day. The second policy that I want to go into is the Logan Amendment to the Yield Bill. So this is a surcharge on unearned income for high income individuals. It's a 4% surcharge. And when I'm talking about unearned income, basically we divide income types into unearned and earned. When we're talking about earned income, we're talking about paycheck income. When we're talking about unearned income, we're talking about everything else. And unearned income is basically income that is that you get by having wealth. So it's the proceeds of wealth. So this policy would impact things like capital gains, interest, dividends, basically these things that basically come into existence through the existence of wealth. It is piggybacking off of a federal tax form that already exists called net income investment tax. And that federal tax form only applies to individuals making over $200,000 a year and joint filers making over $250,000 a year. Once we basically put all of these pieces together of only affecting unearned income above thresholds, thresholding in at these income levels, we see that it only impacts this tax would only impact about 4% of Vermont taxpayers. So the threshold looks kind of low, but putting all of those pieces together, it really is impacting a very small portion of Vermonters. It would raise around $75 million in state revenue. And I also want, I'm not sure if I did finish well. I also want to emphasize that one of the reasons that basically we have been pushing as a coalition for the surcharge on unearned income is that the majority of types of income that would be affected by the Logan Amendment are taxed at a preferential rate at the federal level. So here in Vermont, a majority of unearned income is taxed at the same rate as earned income, which is great. So that basically means that we are taxing the majority of things like dividends, capital gains, et cetera, at the same rate as earned income. At the federal level, that is not true. The top marginal rate on earned income at the moment is 37%. The top marginal rate on unearned income, most unearned income, things like long-term capital gains, is 20%. So basically, there's this really significant difference in how we're taxing earned versus unearned income, and that's basically a vestige of trickle-down economics, of basically saying if we cut taxes for the investor class, it will trickle down through the entire economy, and we've all seen the effects of those policies for decades. So basically, we are saying that by slightly increasing taxes on just unearned income for high income folks, we are slightly offsetting this federal windfall. I'm going to go into a few basically examples of progressive revenue that have passed recently in other states. Just to say, we are not alone in thinking about progressive revenue. Particularly right now, a lot of states are currently grappling with what to do about the fact that the federal government is slashing funding for programs that these states are relying on, and one of the clear areas to move into is progressive revenue. So first, going to emphasize Washington State. Last year, they passed a surcharge on capital gains, kind of also similar to what we were just talking about, and then they recently passed a new income tax on marginal income for $1 million a year. Last year, Maryland passed 2 new tax brackets on high income, similar to the Cole-Priestley Amendment and H 61, 2 new tax brackets on income over 500,000 and income over $1 million. Rhode Island has not seen a tax change written into law, but something really significant this year is that their governor has historically been opposed to any sort of progressive revenue, and their governor switched that position this year and is now supporting a 3% surcharge on income over $1 million. In Maine, they are also currently considering a progressive revenue measure, and actually last week, their governor switched positions on the millionaire tax, basically looking at political forces, among other things, and is now supporting a millionaire tax, which is great, and also shows kind of the political side of this a little bit, which I can't get wildly into as a secret. New Jersey has been kind of updating their revenue code in a progressive way for a little bit. And they most recently basically lowered their threshold for their top tax bracket from $5 million to $1 million. Minnesota used the net investment income tax form to create a surcharge on unearned income, very similar to the Logan Amendment in 2023, and a lot of that was used to fund university school meals. And in Massachusetts in 2022, they passed a 4% increase on marginal income over $1 million. This tax has gotten a lot of fanfare. There was a very large campaign built around the passage of that, and they actually had to amend their constitution. So it was a full amendment. All right, gonna go a little bit into wealth tax light, and I stole a little bit of this from email earlier today, so thank you. So we hear about wealth tax light all the time. It is very frequently the #1 concern that I get brought to me by folks, by members of the public, by legislators, so it's very important that we talk about it. The top line point that I have is that all research that actually looks at the migration patterns of high income people in response to taxation shows that wealthy folks leaving a state because their taxes are raised is incredibly rare. It does exist, it exists at the margins, but it is so rare that it is nowhere near large enough to be effective policy. There's a few reasons why high income folks are highly unlikely to move as a response to their taxes being increased. The first is that high-income folks are actually far less mobile than a lot of basically components of wealth tax flight theories would say. So basically, high incomes are very frequently tied to place. They're very frequently tied to a business. They're very frequently basically grown through place, through being tied to place. High incomes are highly correlated with age, and folks who are older are less likely to move than low and middle income individuals. And when we're thinking about things that all of us want, including wealthy individuals, a lot of this is funded through public investment. If we're thinking about things like good schools, clean downtowns, good infrastructure, quality transportation, all of this requires public investment, and wealthy people want this along with all the rest of us. So putting all of this together, what we see in the data is that actually low and middle income people are far more likely to move generally than wealthy. But we hear that there's basically evidence on both sides. That's what we hear all the time, is basically some people say that people move, some people say that they don't. So I want to go into why we hear this and basically what the other side is saying, like why there's apparently evidence on both sides. So the evidence that is promoted by folks who are resistant to increasing taxes on high earners is very frequently very based in anecdotal evidence. It's very based in like, this one very wealthy person said that they would leave if we pass this, so therefore we can't pass it, which is not how we should be passing, looking at policy. It is very frequently based in fears over the future as opposed to actual data over what happens when we increase taxes on high earners, and fear over the future tends to be a powerful emotional argument. So it's very highly utilized. Anti-tax advocates do basically bring up data very frequently in support of this claim, but we see that it is never basically actually looking at the patterns of high income individuals in response to their taxes going up. Instead, it's looking at overarching migration trends of looking at like how many people generally are moving in and out of the state without isolating it to high earners, or it's basically cherry picking data points instead of looking at actual trends over time. And I also, the last point that I wanted to bring up is that fear mongering over tax flight is part of why we are where we are. Like this is a very effective strategy, and the effectiveness is shown in tax codes by states across the country. But in reality, no state has ever increased taxes on high earners and experienced anything other than an increase in revenue. Taxes on high earners have always brought in revenue, and if high earners were leaving states as a response to increased taxes, we would see that these taxes would slowly bring in decreased revenue over time, but we actually see the opposite. So I'm just going to bring up basically two case studies. I'm going to start with New Jersey, and I didn't put credit here, and I should have. This is from a slideshow by Dr. Christopher Young, who presented this to Senate Finance earlier this year. And this graph is specifically from his study that he did a few years ago on wealth tax migration. He is a leading researcher in the country on tax migration, and he specifically looked at New Jersey. So all of these below should say from Dr. Christopher Young. So in 2003, New Jersey passed a high tax on high earners. And basically what was brought up then is really similar to what we're seeing now across the country, saying that folks are gonna leave. So this was basically the expectation that anti-tax advocates put in front of legislators of saying like, if we were to increase taxes on high earners, this is the trend of out-migration that we would see. What we're showing here is basically the likelihood of earners to move. So you would expect it to skyrocket. What they saw in reality is that basically there was a shift in migration after the new tax. So the new tax is in this like gray bar right here, but it did not skyrocket at all in the way that it was expected to. It was basically just showing that the amount of migration was pretty similar for all income groups. We're going to spend a bit more time looking at Massachusetts. So I think that what's really interesting right now in Massachusetts is that we are seeing in real time what we have seen for decades play out. Basically, we're just starting to get migration data in general across the states for what happened after Massachusetts passed this new tax on high earners in 2022, and anti-tax advocates are basically cherry-picking data in order to try to prove that there is a mass exodus happening of wealthy individuals right now from Massachusetts And this is an example of a news story that is currently running. So basically saying IRS data showing that people are fleeing Massachusetts. So here's what's actually happening in Massachusetts. There is actually no indication from this data that the new tax is driving households from the state. There are actually fewer households that are making over $200,000 a year, which is what the IRS data is showing, leaving after the tax was passed than before the tax was passed. There doesn't seem to be a correlation of high income folks leaving. Overwhelmingly, of the like 30,000 households that have left Massachusetts that was shown in this data, 9 out of 10 of those households have incomes below $200,000 a year. And just generally, we're seeing that basically these articles are taking very large migration trends of saying like people are leaving at the same time this one tax was passed, they must be the same thing, when in actuality they're completely separate issues, right? If we're looking at the data, you can see that if most people who are leaving are making under $200,000 a year, it's likely in response to other issues with affordability, other factors, not this new tax, because most of these people who are leaving are not at all being affected by this tax. And I want to highlight that once again, if wealthy people were leaving en masse after taxes were passed, we would see revenues decreasing from these taxes. Revenues from the Fair Share Amendment have only increased since the amendment was enacted.
A follow-up question. I don't know if it's on maybe a next slide, but the slide before this, so it spoke to in like the email that we have been in conversation about after the year that this was passed, this is what they say. The state lost 4.2 billion in adjusted gross income. So that was on your first slide. So maybe we could speak more to like the 4.2 billion loss in adjusted gross income that they keep referring to.
Right, definitely. So what they're referring to is, yeah, they've lost about 30 million households, which amounts to about $4.2 billion in AGI. Or no, that's just in income. So because it's saying 4.2 billion
in adjusted gross income.
So that means that basically overall, that is the amount of income that those individuals were making, that they are no longer making.
So 30,000 people who left Massachusetts.
Yeah, and it doesn't equate to revenue.
Exactly. And I think that something that's really telling about this is that they are basically using that number, and it's really easy to read that number and be like, oh my God, their revenues are decreasing by that much. When in actuality, that's the amount of AGI that is leaving the state.
And most of 9 out of 10 of them are earning below $200,000 annually, so they're not even portion of this tax differently than everyone else.
So the net revenue was
right. The revenue is still going up from this specific tax. I can't speak to kind of migration lower down in the income spectrum.
Yeah, 6 billion raised to end this, yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so, and kind of pointing out, I missed this point in the slide, that this is also cherry picked in time, basically because this is the most recent IRS data since this tax was passed. But if they actually expanded to the data that came right before the tax was passed, more families left the year before the tax was passed than the year after the tax was passed. It's just very useful to cherry pick data. I think that's the end. Great. Well, that's it. Final TLDR is that tax light is overwhelmingly a myth, but is highly weaponized by anti-tax advocates, and that migration would have to be so much higher than it currently is because it's really at the fringes at the moment for it to be reasonable to affect policy.
Are you able to share that presentation?
Yeah, for sure.
Would you be willing to stop sharing?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Oh, that's okay for anybody who's watching live now.
Great. And I'll also throw the credit in for the researcher who did that analysis on migration trends, and I can also link, he did a full presentation on health tax light in Senate Finance earlier this year, and I'll link his slides as well as his walkthrough.
Yeah, what was really amazing about that testimony, it was very detailed, but what was stunning to me about that was that after that testimony, Senator Chittenden was still convinced that there would be wealth flight if we passed an income tax
somehow
increase
being
in
the
Vermont.
anomaly to all the other places.
Yeah. Right, it's
Like
really
in one
persistent.
ear, out the other.
It's
Yeah.
very persistent.
Yeah.
And I realized I should have put this in actually. We see that this trend of basically wealth tax light not largely existing to hold when we look at border regions. So I know that there's a lot of fear over folks basically moving across the Connecticut River, or like these more like border towns losing population, and we see that this trend of folks staying put holds at border regions and states.
Yeah, you're gonna like uproot your entire life just to save a little bit of money that you won't miss.
Well, I think the other really important thing to highlight is what is being proposed in the two bills is not actually a tax increase on our wealthiest, but it's still a tax decrease. Like, we're not even truly talking about moving back towards really progressive taxation. We're talking about maintaining the status quo. People are not gonna leave because we maintain the status quo.
Right, if the new tax brackets were passed, folks would still see a tax cut this year.
And the status quo we're talking about is 2025, right? Because these changes happen in 2026, so the status quo is not like years ago, it's like literally like less than 365 days ago.
Yeah, like we could talk about actual progressive taxation and people wouldn't leave, but that's not even what we're talking about when we talk about the bills that Kate and I have introduced.
Right, right, and like, I think it's important that, you know, I try to make it very clear very frequently with folks that none of what we're pushing for is at all radical, particularly if we look at historical tax rates, right? Like, in fact, what we are currently experiencing is really radically low taxes on high earners, as opposed to us proposing radically high taxes on high earners. Like, we are fully in the opposite direction right now. What we are currently taxing high earners, the level we're currently taxing is very low compared to historical precedent.
Anybody have any questions?
Maybe a question just about messaging, 'cause this is, you know, Kate spoke to that example of like, you hear the testimony and it's still really, like the data doesn't necessarily make the difference. And I think for some people who are legislators who are, you know, middle income earners, especially those who are like just above the discounted rate for property taxes, like, I think they see this and they think it's totally tone deaf to just even talking about any tax increases, but you know, you hear this with the Democratic Party a lot. Talking about any increase in taxes means you just don't care, you aren't thinking about, you know, the burden of taxation, especially on that middle tier like that especially because of, you know, the rate of property taxes is not progressive, it's very regressive, as I know you know well, obviously, but like, so I'm messaging for those who feel very alienated by the phrase like tax the rich, which there is a large portion of the Democratic Party and of course everyone else that's Republican and more conservative, I think, who are really like, I feel like it's gonna take all of us to, if we want to appeal to that group, to really work on the framing of like the modernization of our tax structure, or like looping them in, because they really lean into this alienating. You're going to alienate, you're going to push away this small percentage of people who really matter to our society. And so like, how do we do it in a way that, I know it doesn't seem like an opportunity to like call in, but be like, no, let's like, you know, kind of group everyone into the same system. And I don't know if there's a way to pair this as well with like, how does this result in more affordability for literally everyone, I hope, like even that portion, I know that might sound a little bit out there, but like, yeah, it's hard to get this messaging succinct, in a way that appeals to people who aren't already like gung-ho on this idea. And so just like really working together, especially for those like, for, you know, the Progressive Party and like, radicals like me and who are affiliated with the Democratic Party too, like how do we make that messaging more unified in a way that's like digestible and appealing to that conservative meaning?
I mean, I do think that we need to be talking about how we're gonna spend the money. So that, I think, is one of the ways that, first of all, I think you can easily talk, like everybody intuitively knows, middle income people intuitively know that most of the gains in our economy have gone to the wealthiest folks and they need to pay their fair share. Like, you can say that in one sentence. And then we can talk about how we're gonna spend this money, and it is gonna impact middle income people's lives. Like, that's really the reality of what we're talking about, because the spending package that we're putting together in the House, like our bills targeted the funding at healthcare and education, and that's essentially where this is gonna end up as well. so it really matters what the appropriations are gonna be.
It really does.
So, the expectation in the House is that we're gonna be using, the income tax, piece to, lower healthcare costs for middle income Vermonters, and make sure that people don't get kicked off Medicaid. So it's like, low and moderate income Vermonters' healthcare costs are gonna decrease after increasing because of federal tax or policy changes. And then I'm still pushing very strongly for the wealth proceeds tax to go into the ed fund. Because it's a regressive tax, or the property tax is a regressive tax. And so if we're going to be doing a wealth proceeds tax, then it makes sense for that revenue to go into the ed fund where the most regressive tax is funding a large part of our public education system. And that would have, along with the money that we proposed to put in, use to buy down property tax rates in a very regressive way. This would basically tax the people who are benefiting most from that buy down and bring that money back into the ed fund. So it would make in an indirect way, make the property tax slightly more equitable than it currently is. So I think that's, though, the messaging that the average Vermonter, again, the 99% of Vermonters who will not be experiencing any tax increases as a result of this. Like the fact that we even have to worry about middle income people defending rich people, first of all, like, I think we need to agitate Vermonters a little bit about this. Like, stand up and stop letting rich people use you. So like we do need to agitate people a little bit, but we also need to talk about like what we're gonna be spending the money on and that it's gonna make a concrete difference in people's lives.
I think the real problem though is in the building. In 2024, 77% of Vermonters polled supported a wealth tax.
Yes.
And I know that there has been some question about that poll. I don't personally question it, but I know some people did. But in November of 2025, Harris, which is not by any stretch of the imagination like a progressive outside whatever, they polled and saw that across the nation, 71% of people supported the wealth tax, including 64% of Republicans. And so I think the messaging is how to get it through this building. It's not the general public. The general public, by and large, widely supports this. 94% of Americans polled agree that there's a wealth inequality problem. Like this is popular. So it's really getting the people in this building back in touch with their constituents. And so that's really, I think, where the messaging is. I don't actually think we need to convince your average Vermonter that we should do this.
I think they need to know about it so that they can convince their own legislators.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, this is of course another anecdotal experience. Like I think the 71+% is very real. I had a constituent come up to me on like Monday of last week or so and expressing how disappointed they were in me for, pushing this policy forward and, a real misunderstanding again of some of the nuance about like, oh, it's a special surcharge to disincentivize, thinking that it's like disproportionately targeting this, and legislators in this body, of course, have come up to me with the same understanding, that it's like a targeted special treatment on this specific population instead of like really looping them into the same tax structure that everyone else is experiencing here below them, particularly because our tax brackets stop at $312,000 in income, at least for Islanders. But the other argument from this constituent's perspective was that, well, more revenue, more revenue, the legislature already spends revenue like crazy and inefficiently, enough more revenue, you're gonna keep spending it in ways that I don't align with. Stop raising revenue, stop taxing us because you're spending it the wrong way. And so I think that is, especially with our, who's at the top in the executive branch right now, that is exactly the message he is putting out there. That's a lot of news agencies who are kind of people are putting out that message as well. So yeah, that tied to like, we are not trying to be just spenders without being in touch for like affordability and all.
Well, and I think that is where Kate's point about talking about where the money is gonna go and how it's going to help
Absolutely.
everyday average
Yeah,
Vermonters. You know, I think one of the things that's been asked of me on a few different occasions is what is Vermont gonna do about the loss of healthcare subsidies?
Yeah.
Like, we could theoretically tax the wealthy and do a Vermont level subsidy. Like, we could really talk to people about how are we gonna take that money and put it in your pocket.
And I think we are, that's the intention. I mean, I think that's been one of I understand why, the Fair Share campaign wouldn't want to speak specifically to appropriations. It's a diverse group of folks sitting at that table, and I would imagine they'd have a hard time coming to consensus on that. And in the end, it's our decision to make anyhow. But that is something that we're concerned about, is making sure that the messaging is very clear and that low and middle income Vermonters are going to benefit primarily from this. But I also think, you know, like we do need, again, I think, to agitate folks in Vermont. You know, the governor always makes single, like, one sentence claims. We need to stop explaining so much and just start saying things like, I dare you to open up the Vermont budget and show me where we could be spending less money. I think we're doing an amazing job of putting like targeted investments in our budget. And you know, like we're doing that at a time when federal funding coming into the state is gonna be decreased, and we need to be making up the gap for healthcare
I
and
think
education.
too, when people bring issues forward, I mean, that they're concerned about helping them to see how the underfunding of systems are adding to that. You know, when someone comes to me and, you know, I just learned today that we are level funding our child abuse prevention organizations. Does the average Vermonter think that we should not invest in preventing child abuse? I suspect not. You know, we are level funding our legal defense systems. Is now a point in time in which we should be continuing to underfund the systems that protect Vermonters from federal overreach, from, you know, and so I think too, like when people bring issues forward, helping them to connect to what an investment in that issue would be.
And what government does for them.
Right, because currently, I would actually argue that if you open up the Vermont budget, what you're going to see is lots of places where we're underfunding systems.
Especially on the preventative angle.
Especially on the preventative side of things.
But
yes,
the treatment
absolutely.
thing, which
Yeah.
is really expensive, like in our, bailing out our nursing homes. As we are doing that, we're bailing out private equity nursing homes to the tune of millions and millions of dollars over and over again.
Absolutely. Well, and I also, you know, hearing in our budget presentation this morning in judiciary, you know, legal aid is asking us for $1.1 million to do tenant law and immigration law. And for every household they prevent from being evicted, they save the state $24,000 a year. And so, yeah, and last year with the funding that we gave them, they prevented 40 households from being evicted. So I think it's also really important to help people make the connections to why spending and investment saves them money. Our budget is gonna keep ballooning if we don't make the investments in social services, in prevention and education.
And I think, like, I just want to emphasize as well that by the federal government pushing costs onto states in a very active way, we either have we have kind of a decision tree of further underfunding really key programs, really key infrastructure, these things that we're all interacting with on a day-to-day basis, or basically letting those things fall into disrepair and not funding them. And if we're thinking about funding them, the first place we should credit folks for getting a $57,000 average tax cut. So, you know, far from kind of state spending ballooning in a really unprecedented and scary and wasteful way, I think that what we're actually seeing is the federal government pushing more and more onto states, and states having to grapple with the reality of that.
I mean, yeah, when you see the average tax cut for the top 1%, pretty close to the average income of a Vermonter, how much they make. So that's not median, that's average income is very close to the amount of tax cut that the top 1% of Vermonters are getting. Again, I don't think, like from the left, I don't think our problem is around messaging so much as it is about mobilization. Like, we know that this is a popular policy. We know that Vermonters need this very, very badly, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease here in the State House, and we have, we have a regressive legislature and regressive leadership, political leadership in the state. And so we really just need to mobilize like constituents to contact their legislators and put enough pressure on them in order to get this through. The governor and literally every legislator. Because I feel like there's what, 30 of us, like 30 to 35 really, really strong supporters, like ride or dies. And then we need the rest. And I really think it's gonna be constituent pressure more than anything else. It always is.
I think the other piece too, and this is just sort of basic, like advocacy, basic mobilization, is we don't need to change the minds of the legislators that are opposed to it. We need to change the political reality so that they can't continue to maintain the position they have. Like, we don't need to convince them. We need to change the political reality, you know, and I regularly, particularly when talking to students, remind people, like, the president that ended segregation was a segregationist. He didn't stop being a segregationist. The political reality came the fact that he could no longer hold that policy position and maintain his power. So it's and I think it's easier to change the sort of political landscape than it is to change someone's mind.
Yeah, well, and I think that we are seeing that in reality this year, and we're seeing that in some changes in the legislature and their position on some of these policies that Mayor Mamdani is pushing for. We saw it last week in the governor of Maine changing her position on a millionaire's tax. I think that there's these like, I think it's bubbling up in a very real way where that's becoming reality, and that would be important for us as well.
Yeah, no, and that's what I mean when I say like Vermonters like need to stand up and defend themselves. Like, it's an interesting culture that we have here. Like, I think, I can't remember, what is it, like 70% of Vermonters work for a small business or something like that. And so that means that you're right up close to the person who's making the money. That's your boss. Your boss is the person that you're talking about. And so I think there's that is like a issue that I've heard in the past when I was organizing around minimum wage all over the state, is that people are afraid to speak out because they're afraid of basically the rich people in their lives who will be mad at them. So it's very personal for people why they won't speak out, and I feel like we really need to help strengthen people's sense of justice and remind them how popular this is. If they just speak out, they'll get what they ask for, and that's, I think, the main task right now is, amping up the political pressure. And I realize everybody's got to run off and do stuff now, so thank you so much, Annika, for being here. Does anybody have any last questions that they want to ask? Okay, great.
And also, I'm here every day, so if you end up having any questions,